On your left is LG's new 27-inch OLED gaming monitor with 240Hz refresh rate. On your right is last year's model of the same screen size. As you can see from this HDR test pattern of a gradually expanding white rectangle, the new 27GS95QE could get noticeably brighter at larger window sizes including full screen, thanks partly to its latest generation MLA OLED panel sourced from LG Display. The higher brightness potential in turn contributed to a more impactful HDR presentation across all types of HDR content, be it HDR movies or more importantly HDR games, which is probably the reason why you would buy a 240Hz OLED monitor in the very first place. Moreover, we found that even though the CPC and logo luminance auto-dimming protective mechanisms remain undefeatable, it's significantly less aggressive, so the newer LG 27GS95QE did not manifest as much vignetting effect or darkening around text blocks as on last year's 27GR95QE. To further mitigate the risk of permanent burn-in, LG has implemented other anti-screen burn measures on the 27GS95QE, ranging from the usual pixel shifting and screensaver functionalities to image cleaning and pixel cleaning manual compensation cycle triggers. Just like on most OLED monitors we've tested so far, there's some over-provisioning of pixels beyond the 2560x1440 resolution, such that pixel shifting will never cause edges of the picture to be cropped off, however slightly. Using an NVIDIA LED device to measure end-to-end system latency, which takes into account the mouse click, CPU processing, operating system, game application, GPU rendering, and finally the display, we obtain an average end-to-end latency of merely 12.5 milliseconds after 100 runs, ranking among the lowest we've recorded to date. To give you some perspective, using the same methodology, we have previously measured more than 40 milliseconds of average end-to-end system latency on LG OLED televisions. Together with OLED's pixel-level light control, which allows for true blacks and vibrant colors, the super low latency and near instantaneous pixel response time meant that you can enjoy top-notch picture quality and responsiveness when playing games at 240Hz, without needing to put up with grayish blacks, blooming, smearing, ghosting or other artifacts that can affect LCD-based monitors. As confirmed by this super macro footage of the subpixels, the LG 27GS95QE monitor is equipped with an MLA OLED panel, which is of course necessary to extract higher peak brightness from a 27-inch OLED monitor. Talking of which, there are two peak brightness settings besides off available on the LG 27GS95QE. Measuring in HDR mode in the more accurate Gamer 1 picture preset, we found the default peak brightness low setting to deliver a peak luminance of nearly 600 nits on a 10% window at D65 white point. Switching peak brightness to high would almost reach 1200 nits on a 1% window at D65 white point, but unfortunately also over-brighten the PQ EOTF tracking, increasing the risk of blowing out bright highlight detail. Full screen luminance was 250 nits regardless of the peak brightness setting, which is a massive improvement over the corresponding figure of 130 nits achieved by last year's LG 27GR95QE. In SDR mode, colors in the default out-of-the-box Gamer 1 picture preset tracked closer to the monitor's native white color gamut, leading to an oversaturated SDR presentation. To obtain the most accurate SDR colors out of the box, you should select the sRGB picture mode, which targets Rec. 709 or sRGB color space. For HDR, DCI-P3 color gamut coverage measured 99% in UV terms, whereas Rec. 2020 coverage was 75%, in line with WOLED displays we've tested over the years. Native 10-bit gradation was fairly smooth, judging from this gray ramp pattern in the Display HDR app. Bright uniformity was excellent on our review sample, exhibiting no bending or dirty screen effect on full-field gray slides, while pink tinting along the sides were kept to a minimum due to the monitor's smaller screen size relative to a TV. Dark uniformity was also very good by OLED standards. The thin vertical streaks were mild enough to not bother us in real-world gameplay. Despite its 2560x1440 panel resolution, the LG 27GS95QE allowed for 4K 120Hz gameplay from next-gen consoles such as the Xbox Series X and the Sony PS5, thanks to its twin HDMI 2.1 ports featuring full HDMI 2.1 FRL bandwidth of 48 gigabits per second. There's also a DisplayPort 1.4 socket for PC use if needed. The monitor adapted its HDR10 tone curve to max CLL metadata at all times, but because game consoles don't output HDR10 metadata for HDR games, the LG 27GS95QE would just default to a 4000 nit tone curve. LG hasn't implemented any HDRG or source-based tone mapping support on the monitor, so adjusting the PS5 or Xbox Series X HDR calibration screen according to the instructions would lead to max TML and max FFTML values that were far too high, causing bright highlight detail to appear clipped in HDRG-compliant games. Our recommendation would be to set max TML and max FFTML to around 600 nits in line with the monitor's measured peak brightness to display HDR games without blown-out highlights. VRR including G-Sync worked well to eliminate frame drops and tearing artifacts, although VRR flicker remained unavoidable in a handful of VRR games, especially on static menus. Thankfully, the frequency and intensity did not appear as obvious or bothersome as that observed on larger OLED TVs. Being a monitor, 444 chroma was fully reproduced natively without any problem, but the LG 27GS95QE was less than ideal for work and productivity purposes, owing to its RWBG subpixel structure, which would look fuzzier with some color fringing when displaying fine text, compared to a monitor with conventional RGB stripe layout. If you still insist on using the 27GS95QE as a productivity monitor, we would suggest experimenting with your operating system's scaling or clear-type subpixel rendering technology to arrive at a result that's acceptable to you. The monitor reproduced 24 FPS material correctly without telecinic judder, allowing for smooth presentation of slow panning shots in 24p films. Moving on to a more contentious subject, the matte anti-glare coating muted reflections well and held onto blacks better than QD-OLED monitors in the presence of ambient light. Up close, however, the microtexture coating would take on a finely grained appearance, especially on white backgrounds, and we couldn't help but wonder if a glossy screen would better complement OLED's true blacks and insanely high contrast. The LG 27GS95QE ships with a remote control, allowing you to adjust various settings without needing to fumble around with the limited joystick at the bottom of the monitor. Let's sum up. The LG 27GS95QE is a significant upgrade over last year's 27GR95QE, delivering higher full-screen luminance, which allows for not only more impactful HDR presentation, but also greater light output to overcome ambient lighting in a bright room in SDR mode. While still undefeatable, its CPC and logo luminance auto-dimming algorithm was less aggressive than on its predecessor, and so the LG 27GS95QE earns our recommended award. Of course, no monitor is perfect, and shortcomings on the 27GS95QE include fuzzy text clarity due to older RWBG subpixel layout, not to mention lack of support for HDRG or source-based tone mapping for more accurate presentation of HDR games. While its 240Hz refresh rate is impressive, some QD-OLED monitors this year boast even faster refresh rates, capable of going up to 360Hz. Surveying further afield, the direct competitor to the LG 27GS95QE would be the Asus XG27AQDMG, which also uses MLA Plus OLED panel from LG Display. The LG provides 2 HDMI 2.1 ports which support 4K 120Hz gaming from next-gen consoles, as well as a remote control that's easier to use than a physical joystick on the monitor itself. Whereas the Asus supports HGIG or source-based tone mapping through its console HDR picture preset, and features a glossy screen which may appeal to certain demographics. To find out how next-gen MLA Plus OLED panel works to increase the peak brightness of these 2024 OLED monitors, please watch my explanation video by clicking here.